Mr. President, we continue to every day set new records for how long it takes for the new president to get his cabinet in power, in office, and the responsibility to carry out the things that the president said he wanted to do when he was elected. In the great history of confirming people from the Garfield administration in the 1880s until Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, the entire cabinet in that whole period of time was confirmed on the first day. Now we're in the longest period in the history of the country since George Washington was president to try to get a cabinet in place, not to mention all of the other jobs that go along with confirming the cabinet. It's a good thing, and no wonder a few years ago the Senate looked at the numbers of people we had just taken responsibility to confirm and said, now which of those do we really have to confirm, and which of those would we only confirm if someone in the Senate believes we have to have a hearing on that level of person in that agency at that time. And so we're trying to streamline a process that we all know needs to be streamlined. But with only a couple of exceptions, every nominee so far has been the most dangerous nominee of all time for whatever job it is. There must be fill-in-the-blank speeches back there somewhere that just go from one day to the next, and this would be the worst person who could ever possibly hold this job. In the case of Congressman Mulvaney, it appears to be because he wants to try to do things that allow our entitlement programs to survive, that he wants to do things that allow the deficit at some point to be eliminated. And no matter what point that is, that point would be too early for some of our friends on the other side. Interesting as we talk about the Affordable Care Act that has turned out to be very unaffordable for almost any family on the individual market, and many families that had insurance that worked for them before. The Affordable Care Act cut Medicare in the plan by $500 billion over 10 years. And we hear speaker after speaker on the other side say, we would never do anything to cut Medicare. I argued vigorously against those cuts when they occurred. I think we ought to be very thoughtful as we move forward that we restore the cuts in areas where clearly it's not working the way people thought the Affordable Care Act would work. And the person in charge of the numbers, the person in charge of the balance sheet, the person who calculates cost should be someone with capacity to do that. And the president's decided, and the Senate, when finally allowed to vote, will determine that that person is Mr. Mulvaney. The other thing we hope to do this week is get to the EPA director. I have a hard time imagining that anybody had more future damage lined up for the economy than the past director of the EPA. You know, rules like the Clean Power Rule. Now, all these rules almost always have a good name. And clean power, who wouldn't be for that? I'm certainly for clean power, but the Clean Power Rule in virtually every state in the country would have increased utility rates. From the middle of your state, Pennsylvania, to the western edge of at least Wyoming, if not beyond that, 50% of the power produced by coal-fired utility plants, most of which are cleaner than any utility plants that use coal have ever been or are anywhere in the world today, many of which are almost new, many of which aren't paid for. And of course, who pays for that utility plant, whether you use it or not? It's the family that pays the utility bill. There is no mythical, somebody else will pay this bill. So if you shut a plant down sooner than you should, somebody has to pay for that. You know, Mr. President, you could write those same rules if your goal was to eliminate coal. That's a different debate. It's a debate we could have at another time. If your goal was to eliminate coal, you could write those same rules. And if the rule just simply said, when the utility plants you're using right now that meet all the current standards, that are in many cases the cleanest coal-fired plants that have ever been built or being used anywhere in the world today, when that plant is paid for, here's what you have to do next. And then when you get your utility bill, you're not paying for the plant you're not using and also paying for the plant you are using. This would be like if there was a new standard. This is the EPA view of this. If there was a new standard on automobile mileage, and that standard came out and said, here's what automobiles have to look like standard-wise on miles per gallon. And by the way, you have to have that automobile, you have to have that car or that truck right now. And if you've got a truck or car that you're already driving that doesn't meet that standard, you can't drive it any longer. Now, of course, you still have to pay for it, but you can't drive it any longer. We've been doing mileage standards in this country that have made a significant difference for a long time, but we've never said you have to stop driving the car you're driving, and you have to buy a new car, and of course you have to pay for the car you're driving, or the bank is unlikely to give you the loan for the new car. But that's what the EPA rule said in Clean Power. There's a common sense way to do things. And the next nominee we'll be dealing with, Attorney General Pruitt, is a common sense guy. He's had great responsibility as an attorney general, but he's been willing to challenge these rules that didn't make sense. And on the power rule, by the way, Missouri is the fourth biggest user of coal-produced energy. Projections were that the average Missouri utility bill under that rule, if it had been allowed to go into effect, still in the courts because the courts say you really don't have the authority to do that, EPA. At least the lower courts have all said that. If that had been allowed to go into effect, the average Missouri utility bill would have doubled in 10 or 12 years. It's not hard for a family to figure out. Get your utility bill out, look at it, multiply it by 2, and see what happens to the things you were doing before you had to pay, in effect, a second utility bill. It's time that these agencies, whether they're agencies that are being evaluated by the Office of Management and Budget, or agencies that are being tasked by the Congress and the President to do certain things, it's time they had some common sense. It's time they thought about families. It's time they thought about jobs. If the economy of the country is better next year, the country will be stronger 25 years from now. I think we spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, what should America look like 25 years from now, instead of what can we do so that families have better jobs next month and next year. It's time we got some common sense into trying to reach the goals that we want to reach, rather than coming up with goals and then reaching them in a way that clearly won't work. The Waters of the U.S., that's not a bad title. Water's important. Waters of the U.S. is important. The Waters of the U.S., that the EPA talked about, decided to take a definition that the federal government has used for well over 150 years, navigable waters, which, by the way, the EPA was given control of in the Clean Water Act, and to decide that, well, navigable waters aren't just what for 150 years the federal government said they were, from 1846 until just a couple of years ago, more than 150 years, what the federal government said they were, which was something that you could move a product on, which meant interstate commerce, which meant the Constitution gave that responsibility to the federal government. But they said, no, that's actually any water that could run into any water, that could run into any water, that could run into any water, that eventually could run into navigable waters. That's what the Clean Water Act, when it said the EPA could regulate navigable waters. In our state, again, it's a Farm Bureau map that's been available for a long time that the EPA has never did challenge during this debate. Only the red part of our state would be covered by the EPA for anything involving water. Things like a building permit, or things like whether you can mow the right-of-way on the highway, or things like whether farmers could use fertilizer in their field, even if it was 100 miles away from any navigable water. All of those things under the rule could have been under the authority of the EPA. And let me mention again, only the part of the map that is red would have been covered by the EPA, the part that's 99.7% of the map. And we have a lot of caves in our state and a few sinkholes. I think those white dots, the 0.3%, are some combination of caves and sinkholes where the water appears to run right back into the middle of the earth instead of into any water. What a ridiculous rule. The kind of rule that the Office of Management and Budget should challenge whenever they're asked to look at the cost-benefit analysis, the kind of rule that a reasonable director at the EPA would never let be issued. In fact, I would say the kind of rule that this Congress eventually, hopefully, will take this responsibility back and say, we have to vote on these rules. We have to take responsibility for things that cost families their extra income and cost people their jobs. So as we get along with the business of confirming Mick Mulvaney to the Office of Management and Budget, and then after that, and before we leave this week, Attorney General Scott Pruitt to be the director of the EPA, hopefully both of them will use common sense as their guideline. Both of them will look at what does this really mean to hardworking families? What does this mean to struggling families? What does this mean to single mom families? What does this mean to young families who are trying to figure out how they can save for the future of their kids' college or even summer camp? A lot of things go away if you double the utility bill. A lot of things go away if it takes a year to get a building permit. A lot of things go away if we don't have common sense in our government. I think this nominee, Mick Mulvaney, the next nominee, Scott Pruitt, both bring that common sense to the jobs that they've been asked to do and agreed to do if confirmed by the Senate.